North Korea loves to show off its strength. Huge parades, missiles streaking across the sky, and troops marching as if they were parts of a perfect machine. It looks like an unshakable power, ready to take on the world, right? But that's just the packaging. Behind the propaganda, the soldiers live a reality marked by suffering, physical and psychological abuse, and in many other ways that you can't even imagine. Today, here at Bello Mundo, we're going to talk about the side that nobody shows, the hunger that affects soldiers, the corruption that consumes the army from the inside, and one of the most shocking topics, the so-called pleasure troop, a scheme of abuse against women that the North Korean government tries to hide in every way. Number 1. The formation of the army. To understand where all this came from, we need to go back in time. After the Second World War, the Korean peninsula was divided in two: the North, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the South, allied with the United States. But this division didn't just remain on the map. It became a powder keg that exploded in the Korean War between 1950 and 1953. It was in this context that the Korean People's Army began to take shape. Since the time of Kim Il-sung, the current dictator's grandfather, the regime has invested heavily in building a gigantic army. And when we say gigantic, it's no exaggeration. Today, the army has more than 1 million active soldiers and more than 600,000 reservists. It is one of the largest armies in the world. But is quantity synonymous with victory? Spoiler here, it's not. Behind the facade, what you see is an army full of problems, both in terms of military preparation and human conditions. Number 2. Outdated training. Having a lot of soldiers may look intimidating on paper, but history shows that it doesn't always guarantee victory. To understand this logic, you only have to remember the Vietnam War between the years of 1955 and 1975. On one side, the United States, with more than 500,000 soldiers, massive air support, and state-of-the-art equipment. On the other, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, with outnumbered and poorly armed guerrillas. The result? The Americans were forced to withdraw, and North Vietnam reunited the country under communist rule. But why did the smaller side win? The answer is strategy. The Viet Cong used guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and underground tunnels to confuse and weaken the enemy. Knowledge of the terrain and popular support were crucial. This lesson is clear. Strategy trumps numbers. And what does this have to do with the Korean People's Army? Everything. North Korean military training is superficial and outdated. While powers like the United States and Russia invest in drones, cyber tactics, and modern combat, North Korea still follows the doctrine of brute force and the use of large armies. Here the focus is on physical endurance and discipline. Soldiers march and follow orders robotically, but receive no technical training to deal with modern military technology, let alone strategy. And this is already taking its toll. Reports indicate that North Korean soldiers are struggling to keep up with Russian forces in the war in Ukraine, revealing just how far behind their combat techniques have fallen. Number 3. Obsolete equipment. And while we're on the subject of obsolete training, let's talk about another critical issue: the North Korean arsenal. On paper, it looks impressive with thousands of tanks, cannons, artillery pieces, and other armaments. But in practice, the story is quite different. Much of this equipment is antiquated, to say the least. Many of these machines were inherited from the former Soviet Union, or even from the Korean War, and should be in the museum, not at work. Many tanks and combat vehicles are outdated and have maintenance problems. The Air Force and Navy also use outdated aircraft and ships without the technology needed to compete with more advanced armed forces. And what does that mean? Well, it means that in a real conflict, this equipment would be easily outclassed by more modern systems. What's more, maintaining this equipment is difficult, as spare parts and technical support are limited. The result is weapons that don't work properly, tanks that break easily, and planes that don't have satisfactory flight conditions. Worrying, isn't it? It certainly is. But, as you will soon discover, this is not the biggest problem faced by those who wear the North Korean uniform. After all, the human difficulties within these ranks can be even more alarming. Number 4. You know when you're in, but you don't know when you're out. While many countries have a compulsory military service that lasts 1 or 2 years, in North Korea the reality is different. There, service can last almost a decade. That's right, 10 years. And even worse, for many young men, there is no choice. It is compulsory. Men face, on average, up to 10 years of military service, while women are also forced to serve for several years, depending on the Army's needs. This means that, instead of studying, learning a trade freely, or building a career outside the military environment, young North Koreans spend the beginning of their adult lives inside a barracks, obeying strict orders, receiving constant ideological indoctrination, and living in far from ideal conditions. For women, the burden is even greater. As well as experiencing the same problems as men, they face extra risks, such as the so-called pleasure troop, a subject we'll cover later. Number 5. Corruption within the Army. One of the most common and unspoken problems is the corruption that permeates the entire Army. Senior officers who are supposed to look after the discipline and well-being of the troops often demand bribes from soldiers. Such gifts can guarantee small advantages, such as not being severely punished for a mistake, getting a bit more food, or escaping heavier tasks. Due to the scarcity of everything within the Army, from food to clothing and basic items, these bribes end up creating a parallel market. Those who don't pay suffer. Those who pay survive a little better. Number 6. Hunger and malnutrition. The image of soldiers marching in perfect sync gives the idea of strength and power, right? But what North Korean propaganda doesn't show is that many of these soldiers are struggling with hunger every day. Reports from defectors and investigations by international media outlets, such as The Guardian, reveal that the food situation in the Army is far from what it is on parade. What they call a meal is actually a thin soup with very poor quality grains and, if you're lucky, maybe a tiny piece of meat or a vegetable of some kind. Now imagine spending months eating just that. The result? Generalized malnutrition. Many soldiers lose weight dramatically, become weak, sick, and, of course, don't have the energy to face the heavy routine of the Army. When the daily meal doesn't do the trick, they have to improvise. Some soldiers scour nature for roots, leaves, and small animals to try and feed themselves. Others, more daring, start self-supplying. They steal food from the Army itself or from nearby farms. That's right, the soldier himself has to become a hunter and gatherer to avoid fainting from hunger. And if you think this hunger crisis has just begun, you're wrong. North Korea has faced severe food crises in the past, and things have only gotten worse with international sanctions, agricultural planning mistakes, and extreme weather. If food is already scarce in civilian life, it doesn't get any better in the Army. Except, of course, for high-ranking officers who have access to better rations and privileges that most only see from afar. Number 7. Poor living conditions. If you think starvation is the worst-case scenario, Wait until you hear about the living conditions of North Korean soldiers. When we think of military housing, we usually imagine a simple but at least dignified place. Now forget that idea. North Korean soldiers live in cold, cramped quarters with no heating, even during the Korean Peninsula's freezing winter. And here, the cold is no joke. When temperatures plummet, the only way to keep warm is to sleep huddled together with other soldiers, wearing old clothes and blankets that look like thin paper. If the cold wasn't enough, the lack of running water makes the situation even worse. Want to take a shower? Better hope you find a working tap. The toilets here are communal, improvised, and often dirty. And if you think that's bad enough, there's more. Lack of hygiene creates the perfect environment for diseases and infections to spread like wildfire. Skin problems, intestinal parasites, and respiratory diseases are practically part of the package for anyone who joins the army. And unlike in other countries, there's no nurse on duty or guaranteed doctor's appointment. Here it's every man for himself. Illnesses that would be treated in days anywhere else can leave soldiers incapacitated for weeks. And before you ask, no, the soldier is not released if he is sick. Number 8. Parallel economy. When the salary doesn't even pay for a decent meal, what does the soldier do? They scrape by. That's the logic within the Korean People's Army. With paltry salaries, constant hunger, and embezzlement by officers, many soldiers are forced into the black economy. And when it comes to survival, there's no rule against it. Within the army itself, soldiers create a veritable internal market for the exchange and sale of food, clothing, hygiene products, and anything else that might help. The aim for many is to get some money to send home to their families, or perhaps to save a small amount for when their military service is over. But make no mistake, it's not easy. Surveillance is constant, and if caught, the punishments are severe. From confiscating everything they've got, to forced labor and long periods of solitary confinement. And if you think this only happens inside North Korean territory, you're wrong. In recent years, North Korean soldiers have been sent outside the country, especially to Russia and conflict zones such as Ukraine. Officially, they go on support missions, but in practice, these soldiers end up being used as cheap labor. And look at the irony. The salary promised to these soldiers is around $2,000 a month, paid directly by Russia. Sounds like a lot, right? Now, guess how much of that gets into the hands of the soldiers or their families? Zero. That's right. Nothing. This money doesn't even pass through the families. It goes straight into Kim Jong-un's coffers, and nobody can do anything about it. Number 9. Desertions. Given all this, it's not hard to understand why so many soldiers try to desert, even though they know the extreme risks involved. And these are not small risks. Defecting from North Korea doesn't just mean crossing a guarded border full of landmines. It also means leaving your family behind. And that's when things get even crueler. That's because if a soldier runs away, the whole family pays the price. They could be arrested, sent to forced labor camps, or even worse. For the regime, desertion is not just running away. It's the ultimate betrayal. And the response to betrayal is usually brutal. Forced labor, torture, and, in some cases, public execution. Even so, the number of deserters is only increasing, which shows how desperate these soldiers are. For many, the fear of being captured is no match for the desire for freedom. The most common escape route is across the border into China. From there, the aim is to try to reach South Korea or some other country where they can seek asylum. The problem is that China does not recognize defectors as refugees. This means that if they are caught, they are deported back to North Korea. And then you can imagine what happens. Despite the dangers, many manage to escape. And when they are finally safe, these defectors become living witnesses to what the regime is trying so hard to hide. Number 10. The lives of women in the army. Remember when we said that the situation for women in the North Korean army is even worse? The military environment, which is already hell for men, becomes a real nightmare for women. They face physical challenges, malnutrition, and an extra burden of abuse and humiliation. In the past, many women have voluntarily decided to enlist. It sounds strange, but in times of extreme hunger, the reasoning was simple. In the army, at least you're guaranteed food. But this guarantee came at a very high price. The situation worsened when the regime made military service compulsory for women. Now, from the age of 18, young women are called up to serve for 7 consecutive years. Officially, men and women undergo training, but in practice, women do extra tasks such as cooking and cleaning facilities, while men are exempt. As well as being soldiers, they also look after the military household. With a poor diet and constant physical effort, many women report that, after a few months, their menstrual cycle simply disappears. Faced with extreme hunger and stress, the body goes into survival mode and deactivates basic functions. At first, some think it's good not to have to deal with the menstrual cycle, as there are no suitable hygiene products. But they soon realize that this is a warning sign. The body is not receiving nutrients even for its essential functions. Those who still menstruate face another humiliation. Without disposable pads, they use reusable cloths, which they have to wash and hide from the men, since, according to local rules, menstruation is treated almost as impurity. And if you think that's it, get ready. Because what comes next is even more revolting. Reports of abuse within military bases are frightening. Studies and reports from female deserters show that a culture of silence prevails. Women rarely report cases of abuse because they know that the system does not protect the victims, but the aggressors. Fear of reprisals means that many opt for silence. And if the subject was already heavy, now comes one of the most controversial topics of all: the so-called pleasure squad. Number 11. The pleasure squad. Among North Korea's most disturbing and mysterious stories, few stand out as much as the so-called pleasure corps. Although Kim Jong-un's regime denies the existence of this group, reports from defectors and international investigations tell a very different story. According to these sources, the North Korean government maintains a secret elite of women selected to serve directly the leader and powerful figures in the regime. The selection process is cold and meticulous. Young teenage girls, usually between the ages of 14 and 20, are recruited and subjected to rigorous screening. They are assessed on criteria of beauty, health, and virginity, as the government requires all members of the pleasure squad to be virgins. According to the Times of India, the group closest to Kim Jong-un is said to be made up of around 25 young women, but other international media point to up to 2,000 women involved in the program. After being selected, the young women undergo special training. The first impression of those who hear about the group is that the women serve as entertainers at private parties and events, dancing, singing, and taking part in exclusive dinners. But the truth goes far beyond that. Deserters reveal that during these parties, the women are forced to take part in coercive sexual activities. In addition, the women are under constant surveillance, without being allowed to contact the outside world or speak to their families. If they try to resist or escape, the consequences are extreme. Reports suggest that some young women who have tried to escape have never been seen again, which suggests that they have been silenced by the regime. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, but according to the defectors, it happens far from the eyes of the world. Everything we've seen so far would be enough to shock anyone, but here's the truth. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of what we know comes from defector reports and international intelligence investigations. Now imagine what's still lurking in the shadows. And so we come to the end of yet another adventure in our Bello Mundo, which is sometimes not so bello. If you enjoyed this trip, don't forget to like and follow the channel and turn on notifications. That way you can keep a close eye on the next stories that are already in the pipeline and promise to take you even further. Thank you for embarking on this journey with us. See you in the next video.